Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the next round of pithy conversation with Kim Scribner and me, Gary Lancina here. We're both part of the CMG consulting team, and we love sinking our teeth into big topics. And today's topic is one that I think is relevant this time of year in the fall for many organizations, which is planning. So I'll start with a few contextual elements, and then we'll go from there. In my regular round of discussions with business leaders across industries, there are some themes related to planning that continue to bubble up. One, we're still experiencing economic shifts and marketplace volatility that is causing disruption and causing people to have concerns about how they prepare best for the year to come. And I think that there's also sort of a sense of or mood of change afoot in annual planning. And I'll just touch on a couple of examples. Talked to an executive vice president recently who said, hey, we're going to plan our next year in 6-month increments. Talked to the head of revenue operations for another company who said, we're going to break it down into quarters, and we're really only going to resource definitively for the first quarter. And everything else is sort of guidelines after that, and we'll make the decisions as we go. And, I wanted to sort of use that to prime the pump for this dialogue because I think given the work we do at CMG, we talk to leaders all the time, and planning is a huge part of the conversation and the actual work that we get on or undertake with them. And so with that, I'll sort of start with Kim and say, how do you come at this? What are some of your initial reactions or thoughts as you think about annual planning and where we are today?
Yeah. So part of what I enjoy about planning at a more frequent rate, doing it more often, is that the practice of planning is more important than the plan itself. And as an agilist, that's a basic principle, right? That's why there's things like sprints in the agile world and it's ongoing planning, because that opportunity to inspect and adapt is super important as the environment is changing on an ongoing basis. Um, that being said, I would challenge that we still have to have some basis of understanding of where we're going in order to make those ongoing plans. So I'm curious, as you're talking to various leaders, Gary, how are they balancing providing clarity and making sure that people know what the destination is? Because the president, for example, is not necessarily in each quarter's quarterly planning conversation.
Correct. It's first of all, I just want to say I'm glad that you labeled yourself an agilist, because otherwise I would have. And this idea of more frequent check-ins and reflection on, we have a plan, how's it going? Should we make any changes either in our execution or to the plan itself? I'm a big fan of that. And there's a sweet spot there, not to do it so frequently that it feels volatile, but not to do it so infrequently that everything feels rigid and inflexible. For me, the conversations that I've had, whether it's a consumer durables company bending metal and assembling big products, or it's a B2B enterprise, or it's a very consumer-oriented digital company, one of the truths seems to be that planning is viewed differently if the company has a solid North Star and some long-term vision or sense of purpose, or on the other end of the spectrum, if the annual plan is as long-term as they get. And right now, in one instance, talking to somebody, and they really don't have a long-term vision. In fact, that's one of the problems they want to solve. But in the meantime, they're trying to make choices about resourcing, customer care, innovation, et cetera. And so because they don't have the North Star, they're struggling to make those priority choices. And so it becomes almost a very reactionary, who prevails in the room this week kind of feel. And, my counsel to them was, hey, we can help with that. And you might want to find some things that most people agree would be no regrets and good for all seasons and good for the foreseeable future, to at least set up those runway lights or guardrails. On the other end of the spectrum, there are companies that have a very solid sense of momentum. They have a very solid sense of direction. and well established, even if not necessarily explicit, values, they're having an easier time making the adjustments to their planning horizons because the the priorities, the needs, the ability to serve customers, that's still clear. All they're changing is, are we looking at what our forecast is going to be for the next 12 months or the next 6 months or something else?
Yeah. So I think there's something embedded in what you said, which is the last responsible moment. I'll just keep throwing agile terms at everyone all day today. And
Love it.
what you're talking about is we don't have the North Star, so we don't have the time to undergo the big evaluation right now. But it would be irresponsible to make no plan at all.
Correct.
And therefore, we're going to plan for the shortest period of time. And that is absolutely something that I could get behind, right? Having run steering committees that are sometimes pivoting on a weekly basis, which is irresponsible to your earlier conversation, right? If we aren't giving ourselves enough time to actually learn from some of the things we're doing, that's too much planning. And that sweet spot or that just-in-time spot, like when we think about both of us have some sort of background or experience in warehousing or manufacturing where it comes from just-in-time materials planning. The same is true for planning for a business operation. And we've talked in a previous podcast about the perfect plan means nothing if you're not good at execution. And so I think
Yes.
this shorter planning cycle allows you also to evaluate how well you are at execution, which I find great value in.
Yeah, and I don't want to miss that point because I think it's incredibly important to understand that the process of planning, and you continue to come back to this in our conversations as a theme, right? The process of planning is really around communication and alignment, more so than who's got the right answer. And this concept of being aligned, moving forward, building in the moments of reflection, um, and recalibration. That's one of for me, I got lots of gray hair. I remember the first time I went through Agile and this idea of frequent sort of reflection, recommitment, and the ability to get the whole team moving in the same direction was one of the most profound positive elements of it. And, what I just had lunch today with a product strategist in the recreational marine space. We were talking about kind of a vectored approach to planning. It's not one long sort of projection that then we're locked into for that period of time. Break it down and understand this is the direction we're going, but that there are forces that may be unexpected or unexpectedly powerful in shifting our focus or changing the needs that we have to pursue. And that idea of kind of move in the direction and then assess, are you still on track for that? Do you still want to be on track for that? Or do you want to shift and kind of refocus a little bit and recommit? Each one of those communication moments is a good thing. And to your point, you got to be careful. And I want to bring this back to this idea of if you plan well but can't execute, it's a problem. The most sort of unfortunate version of that for me is companies who use planning as a proxy for actually making progress. They get so avoidant of execution that plans just spin. And every time they come out of the room, people are like, yeah, it's a great plan. And it's basically fist bumps and high fives until the next planning session, but there's not a lot of doing going on.
Yeah,
And
I
I'm kind
just
of curious about your thoughts on that.
absolutely. So just had this discussion last week in a Teams meeting about analysis paralysis in planning, essentially, and heard folks say, well, I want the plan to be perfect. You don't know when the plan is perfect. Nobody can know when the plan is perfect. And so organizations that get stuck in that, we created a great 3 to 5 year strategy. Cool. It's on the shelf. It's dusty. It does, like, if you're not actually inspecting it on an ongoing basis. But this, even at the execution level, let's call it, where part of the execution is to create a strategy for a small thing, you still have to be good enough. And I think
Yes.
that's what we're both talking about, right? Is that good enough, that just in time? Because until you start actually delivering a product or a service or anything to your customer, you don't know what perfect is. And that is an advocacy even more for this shorter term planning. What I'm curious about from your perspective also is, when is long term planning the right thing to do?
Oh, well, that's a big question. You know, it's funny. You reminded me of an anecdote. I worked at a startup that we sold, and in the startup environment, we were growing at a 90+% rate at the time that we sold the company. And the new owners came in, and I was talking to one of their senior executives, and we were talking about plans. And I said, "Oh yeah, we're on the trajectory we intended. Here's where we intend to be in 5 years. Here's where we intend to be in 10 years." And his comment was, "Dude, long-term planning for me is a 2-year extension with Walmart." Right? So his time frame was much more condensed than mine. And that was a signal for some conversation, some harmonization, some alignment, because we in this sort of fast growing startup environment, we're already looking well downfield, and we had a sense of momentum that seemed prudent for that. He came from a much more mature business where change in trajectory was much less likely. And so the time frames really were the underpinnings of different choice sets and different considerations. And so, that kind of divergence is one signal. I think another one is when there's an organization, and I'm sure that you can relate to this, where everyone in the room looks to a leader to make the decision. That
So and
is
so
one of
said,
those
that's why we're doing it.
that is one of those alarm bells for me that says, where's the strategy? I'm
Yes.
a massive proponent of, if we're clear on our objectives, decisions essentially make themselves, right? We can debate which is the better choice next. What's the next right move? We can debate that. But ultimately, big initiatives come down to, is it on strategy? And can we resource it? Do we have the capabilities, rather than what's the right strategy? And so, that's where, for me, the long-term visions, those are a couple of those indicators. I would also sort of riff on something that you touched on, which is this idea of analysis paralysis in the planning space. For me, one of the joys of a sufficiency mindset is to, both in the analysis and insights phase and in the decision phase, to say, do we feel we have sufficient clarity to move forward, rather than optimal clarity? Because if we're trying to answer every last edge case, we're probably wasting time that would be better spent in execution to get real world feedback, or to learn something about the operations, or to try to build a widget and then break it and understand how we can build a better widget. And so
Well, in
this
that
concept
regard,
of sufficiency is important. Yes.
yeah. What is the leader's role? This is a little bit divergent off topic, but what is the leader's role in creating the environment where people can do that well?
Oh, I love that question. Um, so you you've met me, I've met me. I have a bias that says, in team environments, the two most fundamental predictors of success are clarity of purpose of the mission. What are the objectives? What's the problem we're trying to solve? And the second is trust. And so I see a leader's role, biggest title in the room, most tenure in the room,
Uh-huh.
greatest subject matter expertise, whatever it may be. The leader has a twofold obligation. One, to keep people tied to the problem we're trying to solve. So if we end up sort of veering off and trying to solve, I don't know, world hunger or clean water or something else, when our real focus is how to delight our customers who subscribe to our software services, we got to bring them back. The second, and probably arguably many times more crucial one, is to role model the behaviors that build trust. to encourage people to express themselves, to make it okay to say something that might be not quite correct or a little controversial or provocative, because it will lead to good outcomes. And that trust thing for me, there are books written on this. I would love to write a book on this, but for me, that is so fundamental to great leaders that it's the primary purpose.
Now, what advice might you give? I'm circling back to something you said a few moments ago. What advice might you give to an individual in the organization who runs into a leader in the hallway and the leader says, I want to do this thing, and maybe they're not sure why?
The leader's not sure why, or the
The
person hearing
individual,
it.
the person hearing
Oh,
is not sure why. And they're going to say, we're doing this because Joe Smith said so.
oh, that's man. You're coming up with all these good circumstances here. Again, it's a what's the culture of the place? What are the values? Is it okay in the hallway to say, "Thank you for that perspective, leader. Why?" Or "Thank you for that perspective. Isn't that at odds with our strategy?" And I can give you a personal anecdote there. Was in an organization. I had a fairly big title, but I still reported to somebody else. We spent weeks on a strategic plan. And then we shifted into annual planning. And I walked into the room with some budget projections, and my boss said, "Where'd these numbers come from?" And I said, "Oh, well, we spent all these weeks on the strategic plan, and the first year of the strategic plan is our annual plan. So I just lifted those numbers." And he looked at me and he goes, "I don't pay any attention to the strategic plan. This is what we're going to do." And immediately there was this sort of separation. And, my question was, why? Some why did we bother with the strategic plan? But more so, why are you directing us in a different sort of way than what we just spent all this time aligning on?
Yeah.
Those can be very awkward moments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's bringing it back to where we started today's conversation, right? And the kind of differences or right moments for long and short term planning. I think part of it also is the level at which the planning is done. So I could argue that there's always a case for long term planning, but it needs to allow enough room for the actual execution pieces to change along the way as we get new information. And sometimes leaders might have information that the rest of the organization doesn't, and that's why they have a new idea. But creating the space to have those conversations is important to this ongoing planning process we've been talking about.
Yeah. And, as somebody whose favorite color is gray, um, I tend to find that there's a balance. So long-term plans that are very defined sometimes get adhered to despite what should be changed. On the other hand, very loose and sort of high-level, puffy, soft statements that feel good but don't actually define anything in a long-term plan leave so much space for maneuver and shift that there's no actual direction. And finding the balance there in being definitive but flexible, I think that's what makes our jobs fun, is we're trying to help clients with their strategy, with their execution, with their ability to adjust and take advantage of opportunities. If it was easy, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And at the same time, the basic principles of it are pretty clear. Give people enough structure and guidance that they can make choices. And I think that right there's a fundamental as well. Not so the leader can make the choice, so that the people who have to make decisions day in and day out about operating can say, which of these choices is closest to the strategy we intend, and allow them to sort of take the ball and carry it forward.
So we're here at fourth quarter.
Yes.
And what criteria might you suggest people use to evaluate if they should use a quarterly or an annual planning process?
Oh, well, here's my take on it, and I'm curious how you answer your own question. I think it has a lot to do with the particular rhythm and cycle times in your industry and in your business. Um, in many cases, there are industries where tooling lead times stretch into the months, and new product development projects or initiatives stretch into the years. A quarterly planning cycle with some of those dynamics doesn't make necessarily a lot of sense because there's not a lot of volatility that's going to play out um, in that short cycle time. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, if you're running a retail business or an e-commerce business and you've got a very short feedback loop between what you try and the kind of feedback you get, it may be appropriate to narrow in and shorten some of those timeframes so that, we just heard that the Fed is lowering interest rates and they're signaling they're going to lower it even more. What's the implication on consumer spending going to be as we enter the holiday season and then the first quarter of next year? That's something that in some businesses needs to be considered to make good choices. And so that calibration for me is one of the fundamental places to start, is to sort of reflect, hey, for our business, for our competition, for us, you know, what is that wavelength and what are the implications there?
Yeah. I think aligned with what you're saying at the organization level, I think if I take it one click down to the function level, it might be slightly different also. So you're planning from if we're talking software development, product life cycle might be different based off of the maturity of a product as well. And so when
Hmm.
we start to take product life cycle dynamics into it, that changes the depth of your planning. And my
Yes.
preference is always in that case to have a roadmap of, kind of feature-ish level and the planning process to be more at the quarterly level.
Yeah, yeah. You've just reminded me. As usual, you spur a lot of reflection on my part of an organization I worked at many years ago where we had three levels of planning. We did twice a year, we would look 5 years out. And the one of those cycles was sort of a deep, thoughtful reflection and redefinition of where we might be and what our priorities might look like over that time frame. The second one was kind of a touch base. Did anything fundamental shift? So we need to make a change mid-year, and if not, keep going. Then we had quarterly updates that were down a level, just as you talked about, and much more focused on projects. Like, hey, what's our portfolio of projects? Do we need to
Yes.
reprioritize things like that? And then there was a third level, which was on a monthly cycle, much faster little hamster wheel that was really stage to stage, gate to gate, how those projects were proceeding and what
Right.
we needed to learn. And the feedback loops up and down between those three cycles, I think, at the time I viewed them as gears of different sizes spinning at different rates, but all intermeshed. Um,
Yeah.
and defining whether or not to shift those rates, I think is kind of what we started with, right? Are there things happening in the market or economically that would change how we approach this, or maybe not? And just asking that question can sometimes be quite helpful.
Great insights as always, Gary. Happy to
I
be
love
your
doing
partner
these things
today.
with you.
Until we see y'all next time, thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.